Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know, in our 23rd year, I interview writers and sometimes other brands of artists about their work, what they're bringing out right now, what they've done in the past to get to this point, and what they might have planned for the future. We cast a pretty wide net. We've had musicians on, as well as poets and writers, and we've had actors on, we've had singers on, we have even had sculptors on, and we're lucky enough to get one this evening. More about that in a second. Because we cast a very wide net, if you have ideas for writers or other artists who might be good for our show, watch for our address at the end of the program. I also want to remind you that we're very proud of being such a long existing program here, but we're only one of many on Cape Ann TV. And this community project, which is really rich because Cape Ann is rich in artists and energy, is very important to us and everybody on the Cape. You don't get that community access, community spirit and energy on Dish. So stay away from Dish. Stick with cable and access TV. I'm very proud tonight to say that we do have a variety of artists. We're getting away from writers for a minute, and we're going to talk to a wood sculptor and craftsman by the name of Jay McLauchlan. Jay was originally born in Cleveland, Ohio, but he's been all over the country. He kind of migrated to the West Coast and then came back to the East Coast. And I'm going to give you a little bit about his background and then ask him to fill this out. He went to school in St. George's School in South Dartmouth, and he says, excellent shop teachers when he was just a boy. And that's where his woodworking sense and taste and desire and drive began. He also, because his parents lived on a boat for 18 years, is very familiar with boatyards and also sailing. He spent several years in the Army, and when he got out of the Army in 1954, he went to Berkeley in California and took a degree in physiological psychology. But he was more interested in his minor, which was sculpture and design. When he got out of Berkeley, he didn't go into physiological psychology. He talked to woodworkers across the United States until he found a place where he could continue his craft and interest in wood, and went to the New Hampshire League of Arts and Crafts in 1958. Shortly after that, 1963, he came to Gloucester, and he's been here ever since. Jay McLauchlan, welcome to the Writer's Block.
Thank you so much, John. It's an honor to be with you. I've had a very interesting opportunity in my life to actually enjoy the work that I do. Not everybody is so lucky. When I got to New Hampshire, that was a result of not being able to work with any of the existing craftsmen who were exceptional here, and I'm thinking of Nakashima, Maloof, Eichrick, a fellow named Carpenter, appropriate, and Jake May, just to mention a few of them. And I asked all these fellows if I could apprentice with them, and they said no. They were all set. They didn't want somebody to come in there for 6 months and then take off and do their own stuff. But I got a connection with David Campbell, who was the president of the in New York, the American Craftsman Council, and he gave me a job in New Hampshire, and I was fortunate enough to work with a fellow named Alejandro de la Cruz, who was an expert. He's from Barcelona, and he was an old world craftsman, knew joinery unbelievably well, and I was able to learn the joinery part of the craft from him. So I was able to combine the sculpture and design that I was exposed to in Berkeley and the detailed joinery from De La Cruz. And when you're starting out, you got to go into as many shows as possible, and so that was an opportunity to look for new new designs. You aren't copying things. And where does that creative part come from? Part of it is filling a void in a funny way, and I don't know if you run into that with your poetry, but you have an opportunity, and then you say, "Oh, this hasn't been treated before. This hasn't been done before." And a specific example would be, say, you're designing a chair. You're aware of the historical survey of chair design going back to the Egyptians and the Greeks and all of the different Renaissance styles and on into the modern, and you can sort of pick out parts of that, what really fascinates, and then also what hasn't been done. A factual example was that I made a one-legged rocking chair, which was in the museum show, actually. It's a pedestal rocker that it has a cantilevered seat out of the back, and the back is just one leg and goes down to a platform that rocks in two different directions. That's an example of sort of looking for a chance to do something crazy and different.
Let me go back. I want to get a definition from you to make sure our audience understands this. The distinction between learning wood sculpture and then as a part to joinery. And you seem to separate those as joinery generally for items of different parts, rather than a piece of wood that you're going to sculpt and it's going to be one piece out of a trunk of walnut.
Exactly. The wonderful thing about the glues that we have today and joinery techniques are that you can do a particular design even in clay, and then copy that design in wood by taking a large piece of wood, cutting it up into smaller pieces, and gluing it back together again in any configuration that you want to, and then sculpting that, and so then you get a result that hangs together. There are pieces that I've made out of one big piece of wood, but generally speaking, they're assembled and then carved down.
So you're going to create your one big piece of wood.
Exactly, yeah.
I want to make sure we mention that you had an important show here in Gloucester at Cape Ann Museum back in the winter of 2011-12.
Yeah.
And viewers or internet browsers can still go to the Cape Ann Museum website and see an excellent bio of you with a couple of nice pictures that didn't work out here because the pixelization was a problem, I understand. But Cape Ann Museum's website has a good item, a good article about that show, in which you had a good number of pieces. And
yeah, there are about 44 pieces there, and picked photographs of staircases. I've done over 50 staircases, and I took photographs of all of them, and I brought in probably 12 of the most interesting staircases that I'd done. And when I say complicated, interesting staircases, these are flying, winding staircases with whole systems and putting railings together for 70 feet of railing that are all laminated so it looks like one railing. It's a challenge. I've enjoyed the challenge of making complicated things. It's almost creating a puzzle and then trying to solve it.
Has your designing moved away from paper to computers now?
Oh, no, I don't do computer design. I still have an old-fashioned drafting table, and I still use the drafting table.
With pens and ink?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah. But joinery is incredibly important because there are people out there there are some people who are very good designers, but they didn't follow good joinery practices, and their pieces don't last. And you take a look at a sarcophagus, for instance, that's 3,000 years old. If the joinery is so good in those Egyptian pieces that someone could sit in one and float down the Nile and not get his pants wet. I mean, it's just amazingly good stuff. The combination of the two are what's important. And I go back, I want to include one other important factor in the commissions that I've done, and that is getting to know the people that you're working for. And that makes a tremendous difference. That makes the whole thing a lot more personal, a lot more fun, satisfactory for the client, satisfactory for me, make friends, and so on. And I've been extremely lucky in that regard.
You must have a huge work area for putting these staircases together.
I have had in the past. Now I don't do any more staircases, and my shop isn't very large, but I have had large areas to do that. I did work in Florida for a while, but I want to tell you a little bit about my introduction to Gloucester.
Please.
When, as I said, I worked in New Hampshire for about, I think 6 years there, and because my marriage dissolved, I moved, and I could go anywhere I wanted to, but I wanted to go to a place where sailing was important and where there was a nautical environment. And when I came to Gloucester, I just fell in love with it. I mean, it just spoke to me. This is where to be. And found a shop space and an apartment at the Beacon Marine Basin in 1963, and it was wonderful. My shop was just as you come in the driveway there, right on the corner. Nice big building and nice big workspace, and I got jobs working on boats. I did a lot of restoration, boat restoration, and I set up a interesting soak tank. In those days, they had just developed a way to cure wood with polyethylene glycol, which is a waxy antifreeze-like substance that goes into wet wood and displaces the wood, the moisture in it, and bulks the fibers with wax. And I processed ebony, lignum vitae, rosewood, applewood, all kinds of very wet wood, and soaked it for 3 weeks and in this process. And that was before we stopped using tropical woods. Now we boycott tropical woods because of the poaching and everything. But in those days it was legitimate, it was okay. And I made a lot of rosewood furniture and some ebony work, and that was wonderful.
I wanted to touch on this congruence between sailing and woodworking.
Yeah.
You mentioned before the show that you have sailed all your life since you were a boy,
Yeah.
and coming to a nautical location was important
Yeah.
in '63. Was that partly because your parents lived on a boat and you were always acquainted with water? And
A huge influence.
was that stronger because it was a wooden boat and you liked wooden boats and worked in
it all dovetailed in, but the tradition of Gloucester.
Dovetail's a good
The
good
tradition of
term.
the tradition of Gloucester, the heritage, is so rich in the background of boat building in Essex and so on, and fitting out in Gloucester, that I'm glad it continues with people like Harold Burnham and the Maritime Heritage Center, which now I'm on the board. I have been since the start of the Maritime Heritage Center, and I continue to work with them. And it's also the theater. For a while, I got involved with doing sets with Mary John Boylan and Israel Horowitz at the Gloucester Stage Company. For 10 years, I worked for them, and that was a wonderful experience for me. So it's been. I just had to mention how much I respect the atmosphere around here, and
You're not going anywhere
it
soon.
continues.
Before the show, you mentioned that and I mentioned this in the introduction, that it was some early teachers who really got you interested in the idea of wood and art. What year were you at school when that happened? And can you remember something about how those teachers motivated you?
Well, I was 13 years old, and the first assignment was a pair of sawhorses, and it was good wood, exquisite. I think we used mahogany. It was exquisitely complicated and designed. And yet they were very functional.
To make a couple of sawhorses?
Oh, yeah, yeah. And as you progressed, the projects got more and more complicated. But I built a house recently, timber frame construction, and I needed some really strong horses for that, the timbers to work the huge timbers, and I duplicated those, and that was just a funny coincidence that ran through. But that early training was very special, and I do remember it. And the teacher was Prendergast was his name, German fellow, very precise, and that was something that's.
Imagine building sawhorses a little more complicated than it seems at first.
Oh,
I've seen sawhorses that aren't quite level.
No, these were very special, with all fitted in. They looked almost like a piece of simple sculpture themselves. Yeah, but the boat restoration jobs that I've done, I worked on the Adventure for a while, and we found a 1906 launch powered by a one-lunger engine, and Billy Lee and I we restored that boat, and only 16 feet long, but that was a wonderful project, redoing that.
You just touched on a point I wanted to get to before we get too much farther along. You said those sawhorses were so refined and beautiful, and you're using fine wood. It was almost like a piece of art. And that question of craftsmanship and art has always intrigued me. When does a craft become art, or is it always? Are there borders and questions there we can touch on?
Well, I think the studio movement exemplifies that, and that really was when potters, weavers, metalworkers, woodworkers were recognized as the top of the line, where the beyond form follows function. It was not just functional, but stated something. It stated this. It was an expression. It was sort of in between sculpture. You know how interesting pottery sculpture is today, and glass blowing is another example.
And you're talking about the studio movement in the 50s.
Yeah.
That was very active in, say, Asheville,
Yeah.
and New Hampshire and Northwest.
Yeah, and California.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't. When I go to a museum and see a painting, I think of the work that went into the painting, not just what the painting says to me, not just what the depiction is, or the feeling that emanates from it, but I think about the artwork that went into it. When I read a poem, when I read one of your poems, I think of the work that goes into it, not just what's said in the poetry, but also what was the process that went through it. In a play, that you think we can think of the director and the writer, as well as the acting.
And the set.
Sure, and there's a recognition, especially in the crafts, that the craftsmanship is there, but also it's part of it's an art piece. It's a one-off thing.
So it's functionality that intends to do more than be simply functional.
Absolutely.
And
absolutely.
it has to be unique.
Yeah.
So you can't buy it would be less artistic to buy a huge set of chairs identical chairs
Yeah.
than one unique item that, as you say, is a one-off.
Well, I'm not knocking good design that we might see Henry Miller, Florence Knoll, exquisite Eames chair, Corbusier, these very good designers that were mass-produced. I'm not knocking that. I
Just
recognize
good design, but not art.
it's terrific.
Yeah.
Well, they're in the museums. It comes close to art, even though it's mass-produced. But the one-off pieces that are individually made and individually crafted are really a chance for artistic expression, even though it's in the crafts. And of course, some really fine, famous artists have. Picasso did a lot of pottery. There are people who have designed weaving pieces that are 30 feet by 20, huge, like tapestries. And so it's a long-standing tradition. But I just think that the key thing here is the creative opportunity. And that's the excitement of it. That's the fun of it.
So I've seen one of your tables, and so you take the glass off, and you've got this support for the table. It looks to me as if it would stand completely by itself as abstract art.
Yeah.
Can woodwork or other forms of art be both functional and art, and those necessarily not the same?
No, absolutely. I think that's really true. Good. The word is quality. One of my favorite books is Robert Pirsig's Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, where he talks about the philosophy of quality, and that's one of the most influential books I've read, and I'm an avid reader.
I just got the 5-minute signal from our camera person, Kate, and I wanted to make sure I ask you before we leave a couple of books on woodworking or wood sculpture that you could mention for our readers to go to and where they could see more of your work.
Oh boy, that's a tough question. There's a German book by a fellow named Mines, it's a treatise on staircase design that I really recommend. As far as a particular book in woodworking, I would go to a magazine called Fine Woodworking Magazine.
I've seen that.
And that's just excellent. And most of it, I don't know how much of it's online, the back issues, but I think
Fine Woodworking.
Fine Woodworking.
And where can our viewers see more of your work?
I don't have a website. I have my portfolios, and people, if they want some particular thing, they contact me, and then we sit down and I show them my portfolios and we talk about it. So it's really personal.
You're open for contact.
Oh, sure.
And
No more staircases, though.
No more Okay, if you want to, so if viewers want to contact you about creation of a particular piece, I should look you up. You're in Gloucester.
I could do that. Yeah.
I just got the 3-minute signal from Kate, so I'm going to have to begin to wrap up.
Sure.
I want to thank you very much for being with us, Jay. I've enjoyed this.
Well, thank you, John.
I hope our viewers have enjoyed it too. I'm sure they have. If you've learned something about woodworking and the idea of creating art in wood from Jay McLauchlan this evening, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block.